speak of number 9, you know how
Yeah.
Rocket Richard got number 9?
Well,
And he
isn't it
came up
with
for this.
with the train berths and all that? Isn't
No,
that what?
no, no. He came up his first year that he played, wore number 15. And he broke his leg in the first game after Christmas. First time I ever saw him play. I was 10 years old. And we'd come down from Regina. My dad used to commute. And the season, he'd leave Regina on October the 1st. And he'd be home at the end of March, middle of April. You know, a 48-game season and 50. So that was 50. Anyway, he was playing his, I don't know how many games he had played. He was the Canadians were trying a lot of young guys at that time. He got hit with a body check by a Boston defenseman named Jack Crawford, or Johnny Crawford, I guess it was. Johnny Crawford was the only player in the NHL who was wearing a helmet at that time. And the reason he wore the helmet was not for protection, but he was bald, and he was embarrassed by it, and he didn't want people to see his bald head. Anyway, he had the helmet, and he hit Rocket, and Rocket was gone for the rest of the season. His season was over, and he was injury prone as he was an amateur player. Anyway, the next year, and the Rockets told me when I interviewed him from my book, The Habs, he said, "I was surprised your father asked me back to the camp next year." Well, my dad really liked him, you know. So he came to my father during the training camp and asked if he could have the next morning off because his wife was having a baby. I probably did it through an interpreter, one of the other players, because I don't think he could speak English. And my dad said, fine. So anyway, he wasn't there the next morning for practice, but he was there in the afternoon. So my father asked him how it went. Now the baby's born and everything's fine. And my dad said, how much did the baby weigh? He said, 9 pounds. My dad said, well, why don't you have a nice memory of it? Would you like to take the number 9? So the Rocket said, no, I guess so. That's how he got number 9. And he started the next season with number 9. And needless to say, the rest is history.
Did 9 become the number of the best player on the team because of Rocket around the league?
No, he was a kid.
No, but I know. But when you think, but by the time, so how
created a trend in the league, right?
Where did the trend come then? I mean, Howe was 9, Bathgate was 9, Richard was 9, Hull was 9.
I don't know. You know, you'd have to ask the teams that. Ted Williams was 9, wasn't he? And the Boston Red Sox.
And Sillaps was 9. So Sillaps was 9.
Sillaps was 10.
I think he wore both.
Oh yeah, okay. Charlie Conacher was 9 for the Leafs.
So I got to tell you one story, Darren. Before you, so late 70s, I'm this snotty-nosed kid in Toronto going to university, and Dick comes in, and Montreal's in town. Dick comes in, and we're sitting in the little client room. We called it the client room. It was the green room at Maple Leaf Gardens. And it's just Dick and me, and I am scared out of my wits that Dick Irvin is sitting there. And he says, so you think you know a lot about hockey? And we go toe-to-toe about hockey trivia for a half an hour before anybody else showed up. It was one of the greatest days of my life. And from that moment on, Dick Irvin and I became friends.
I remember you and Doug Beforth used to be in the booth. He used to get me my Cokes.
That's right.
When they finally let the Montreal broadcasters into the Maple Leaf Gardens and vice versa. Well, and Danny Gallivan never did a game in Maple Leaf Gardens until he did a few games for CHCH.
Right.
Wednesday night.
Until he actually did the Leaf games. Correct.
Yeah. Foster Hewitt never did a game at the Montreal Forum until he did the first game of the 72 series.
Wow.
Yeah. So the 67 series when the Leafs beat the Canadians, it was in 6 games, was that? Anyway.
Yes.
Danny and I did the games in Montreal, the first 2 games of the series. Brian and Bill did the next 2 games in Toronto. We did the game 5, and they did game 6, which happened to be the cup-winning game. That was the way it worked in those days. Never the twain shall meet, you know?
Well, why is that? I didn't realize that. And why was that set up, Dick?
No idea.
Because
that was the rule. When I joined the show, that was
2 teams. There was only 2 teams in Canada, and the Toronto broadcasters did the Toronto games, and the Montreal broadcasters did the Montreal games. Those were the rules. And we had a similar situation when I started. We only had 3 teams in Canada, and Jimmy Robson did. Now the anomaly in Vancouver was we only had 4 Saturdays on television in Vancouver. 4. That's all we had. So Jimmy did the 4 games, and really what happened was early 80s. Things started to change a little bit. We had a lot of pressure from, we had deals in the United States. So Dan Kelly started to do some games. that were on the networks, and because we were being seen in both Canada and the United States. And then what happened was that CBC started to insist some of their guys do games, and they weren't affiliated with certain teams. Like Don Whitman became a part of the broadcast play-by-play crew. So it's funny because I do lots of stuff in the other cities, and I keep getting asked on a national night why, for instance, John Shorthouse doesn't do the Canuck game, because that used to be the tradition, was that the local guy did the national games in those cities. But I think, Dick, when you talk about that, I think that was one of the factors in why you and Danny became so iconic, was that we knew there were things that on a Saturday night, you knew you could see the lighting in Montreal, magical, the cameras in Montreal, the brightness of everything, the crowd, and there was Danny and Dick. And that was part of the magic of Saturday night with Montreal Canadiens hockey.
When I was growing up in Regina as a kid, my dad was coaching in Montreal. The only contact we had with the National Hockey League was Saturday nights on the radio, Foster Hewitt. It was always Foster Hewitt and the Leafs.
Yeah.
And I used to get so nervous because every once in a while during the game, he would give the out-of-town scores, all two of them. And I was always so nervous when he was waiting to hear what the score was in the game in Montreal, where my dad was coaching. And one night when I was quite young, my mother used to tell this story about me. The Canadiens played in Toronto. So at least we could hear the Canadiens, our own team. And they got a penalty. Montreal got a penalty for too many men on the ice. And so I'm a kid at home, and I started to cry. And my mother said, "What's wrong?" "Well, they got too many men on the ice. Dad's going to get fired." I thought he'd get blamed and that they would fire him right away because he had too many men on the ice. But that was it and growing up there. And the only difference would be in the playoffs. And then if the Leafs were eliminated, for a few years, Doug Smith was Danny Gallivan's predecessor here in Montreal. You would get him doing the game. I remember when the Canadiens won the cup after a long drought. Their first cup of the new era, when they won a lot of cups, was 1944. And Toe Blake scored the winning goal against Chicago in the cup-winning game. And Doug Smith did the broadcast. And it wasn't Foster Hewitt. It was the Montreal broadcaster was on the CBC network. That's the only time. Otherwise, it was only Toronto and only Saturday nights.
But didn't it change too? Didn't it change after Frank Selke Sr. moved to Montreal and realized that the Leafs were the national brand and they wanted to be part of having a national brand with Canadians too?
Yeah, I don't know. He moved in 46.
Yeah.
I don't know whether he had anything to do with that or not, or because by the time I moved here to live here, the family moved at full time, 51. The games are on television. No, they weren't on television.
No, next year.
The television hadn't started.
Yeah.
And the first year was 52-53. Danny was doing the games, but only Saturday nights. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I think I don't know what the setup was. It was only Saturday. And all the games weren't even on radio in those days. I mean, some games weren't on anything. They just were playing. Just read about in the newspaper.
How did you get into doing the commentary? And did you want to do play-by-play? Was that a goal of yours, or did you enjoy being the analyst?
Well, I started out doing play-by-play on radio, and for just right at the same time, pretty well, about a year after I started with Hockey Night. No, I didn't. Really, I had no thought, Darren, at all as to. I don't know. I just fell into the job, and Danny was there, and that was the way it was. And then Danny retired, and my main job on the show, as John will attest to, was doing the color. And my last game, you mentioned Don Whitman's name, John. My last game that I did in the booth was 1999, a playoff game on Sunday afternoon in Denver between Colorado and Detroit. One of those makeup games. Like you called me like on a Friday and said, "Be in Denver on Sunday," sort of thing. The makeup thing. Yeah. So I go to Denver, and with Jimmy Huff was the director. And Detroit had won the first game of the series on a Thursday night. Now they're playing Sunday afternoon. and Detroit won the game, and that was my last game in the booth. You had me do a couple of games after that. Remember, we used to do a recap during the periods, and
Yes.
and
Yep.
yeah, well, I did a couple of those for you after this, but this was the last game I was in the booth. Detroit wins the first game of the series, and they really toyed with Colorado. It wasn't much of a game, and the score wasn't big, but Detroit was totally in command. Patrick was playing goal for Colorado, and they go back to Detroit ahead 2-0. I mean, it's going to be over fast. Red Wings didn't win another game. Colorado beat them 4 straight. So a few years later, I'm in Toronto with Scotty, who was coaching Detroit at the time, and we were together on the Hockey Hall of Fame selection committee, and we ended up in a taxi cab somewhere going somewhere. And I said to him, Scotty, that the last, and I go into this story about how come you lost 4 straight after winning, and he said, too many injuries. And I knew that the conversation was over. Okay, don't ask another question about that one.